Hi everyone, welcome once again to yet another episode of our series of videos concerning fundamentals of networking. This time along we shall be discussing cables and interfaces, and this video will be broken down into three separate parts. So we shall have part 1 and part 2 as well as part 3, which will be our final episode, but all lie under episode 1. So we are discussing cables and the interfaces, where we shall get to understand how network communication takes place and how the cables and interfaces are laid out. All right, so before we proceed, let's just first go through what we are going to be discussing throughout this episode. We shall be understanding the interfaces, that is concerning which pins are used in communication, and also we shall be discussing Ethernet, which is another big topic, though we shall not exhaust it explicitly, but we shall be able to understand much of the concepts. And then also we shall discuss bits and bytes. Also we shall be able to understand what UTP and fiber optic cables are. And then we shall actually try to understand the communication pins for common network devices. Which pins do some of the common devices use while communicating? Then also we shall look at certain type of cables which are used in networks, that is crossover and straight through cables. And also we shall be looking at one of the new feature which is included in some of the devices, and that is called auto mdi-x, and we shall be able to know what it actually means. Then also we shall look at terminating crossover and straight through cables, because it is a good skill that any person in the network field should know, where you can make your own cables from scratch. Okay, so let's get started with part 1, and this part is actually focusing on interfaces. So we have the front part of the one of the switches, and this is a 24-port switch, and that is how it is actually laid out, but we are going to break it down and see what actually is there. There is something which is not seen clearly here, but I'll zoom so that we can get to see that part clearly. So we have some label there where we are seeing 10 stroke 100 stroke 1000 ST port 1 to 20, and ports are auto mdi-x. I said we shall be looking at auto mdi-x later on to know what actually it means. Then when we look at those interfaces, those are RJ45 interfaces. And what is RJ45? That is a short form of registered jack. So it is actually a connector which is always put at each end of a network cable, and it looks something similar to that. Then let us look at Ethernet. We saw that Ethernet is one of the concepts we are going to understand, and someone may be wondering what Ethernet is. It is actually not something so complicated, but Ethernet basically is a collection of network protocols and standards. So they define the type of cabling usually as defined by the standards, because there are so many different standards based on which type of cable is used in communication. So Ethernet is basically a collection of network protocols and standards. Let us dig deep and get to know why Ethernet is important. As I said, the collection of protocol, and you know very well that in networks, protocols are actually agreed upon rules that must be followed when communicating. Now, why do we need them, and why are they important? One, let us look at a scenario where we have two people speaking different languages. For instance, if we have this person speaking English and then this person speaking Kiswahili, for instance, these two cannot be able to communicate because they don't have a common way they can use to communicate. So communication cannot take place. Then we have also this scenario where we have to connect possibly maybe to the switch or to the router or to the PC using an Ethernet cable with the RJ45 at the end. But again, on the other side, we have the USB port. So when we try to connect, obviously, the answer will be no, because there is no match at all. So this device cannot connect due to mismatch of the interface and then the connector. Without Ethernet, actually, devices from different manufacturers possibly would not be able to communicate. But because we have that standardization, you'll find devices from Apple running Mac can easily communicate with devices running Windows. Otherwise, without standards, it means that the Macs would communicate with Macs, and then the Windows PCs will also communicate with Windows PCs. But because of the standardization, it is possible that they can communicate. Okay, let us look at bits. We have a bit is simply a binary digit, either 1 or a 0. But when we combine, or when we have 8 of them, they form what we call a byte. So 8 bits form what we call 1 byte. Then when it comes now to communication, speed is usually measured in bits per second, just like that. So data travels or moves from the source to the destination as bits each second, but not bytes per second, like that. So you will not see that happening in communication. So bytes are units for storage, but bits are units for transmission. For instance, we can have KBs, which is kilobits per second, Mbps, megabits per second, Gbps, which is gigabits per second. So we don't measure speed in bytes per second. Okay, let us just look at different units of data transfer. For example, when we look at 1 kilobit, we are talking about 1000 bits. Come across these units. Usually, you will not find it demarcated in bits, but you'll find higher units like kilobit, which actually is equivalent to 1000 bits. And then also you find megabit, where 1 megabit is 1 million bits. And then we have 1 gigabit, which is 1 billion bit. And then we have 1 terabit, which is 1 trillion bits. So those are the units that normally are represented to cut everything short, but all goes back to bits per second. All right, then we have different Ethernet standards as defined under IEEE 802.3, which was standardized by the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. So whichever electronic is to be manufactured, it has to be approved by the IEEE. So it has a standard when it comes to network, which is defined under IEEE 802.3 standard. So we shall come across different standards for different types of cables. Okay, let us look at some of the Ethernet standard for the copper cables, especially the common network cables, where we look at speed ranging from 10 megabits, 100 megabits, 1 gigabit, and then 10 gigabits. So they have some common names which are actually given to them. For example, 10 megabits are referred to as Ethernet, and then 100 megabits, that is fast Ethernet, and then 1 gigabit, that is actually gigabit Ethernet, and then 10 gigabits per second, that is 10 gig Ethernet. And then let us look at the IEEE standards. For Ethernet, is defined under 802.3i, and then for 100 is defined under 802.3u. Then for gigabit, that is 802.3ab, and then for 10G, that is 802.3an. So you may need this for purposes of understanding where each speed is actually categorized under Ethernet. Then we have the formal names which are actually given to them, like 10 base T, 100 base T, 1000 base T, and 10G base T. So that is basically the informal, sorry, not the formal, but informal name. And then base actually refers to baseband signaling, whereas the T refers to twisted pair. And then the maximum length for each of these cable is actually a maximum of 100 meters. They don't stretch beyond 100 meters. All right, so when it comes to UTP cables, this is actually how the cable looks. I know you might have come across that. So UTP basically stands for unshielded twisted pair. And now we have the outer coating usually, which helps protect those cables, because as it says unshielded, the cables don't have any shield which protects them from interference or from damage. Most cases it is just that plastic coating, the plastic cover, which protects it maybe from basic protection usually. So there's no high-end protection provided to UTP cables because they are basically unshielded. Then that is actually how an Ethernet cable looks. It is an 8-pin cable which plugs in into the RJ45. Okay, so we are going to look at the different speeds, like for 10 base T and then 1000 base T. So when it comes to 10 base T UTP cables and 100 base T, we have 4 pairs, which are 8 pins. But under Ethernet, actually I'll be using Ethernet instead of 10 base T, and then fast Ethernet instead of 100 base T. So under Ethernet and fast Ethernet, only 2 pairs are used in communication, and that makes it 4 wires. Whereas for 1000, which is gigabit Ethernet and 10 gigabit Ethernet, all the 4 pairs are used. So it means that all the 8 wires are used in the cable. So let's first discuss the difference under 110 base T, and we try to understand the different pins which are used, or which pins are used by certain devices while communicating. So let us first discuss the fast Ethernet and the Ethernet speeds, that is 10 megabits and then 100 megabits. We consider a PC connected to the switch. So, which interface does the switch or the PC use to send and receive? So for the PC, sends using pin 1 and 2, and the switch also receives using pin 1 and 2. Then, which interface, or what is the next pair that is used under Ethernet and fast Ethernet? Actually, it is not pin 3 and 4, it is pin 3 and 6. And that is basically how transmission will take place. So it means that the switch transmits using pin 3, since it receives on pin 1 and 2, so it transmits on pin 3 and 6, because it cannot transmit on the same pins it uses to receive. So this one now allows full duplex transmission, where both devices can transmit at the same time without any interference. Then we look at also another setting, a switch plugged into the router. Still, like a PC, routers transmit on 1 and 2, and switches receive on 1 and 2. Switches transmit on 3 and 6, and routers also receive on 3 and 6. Then full duplex is also supported. And by the way, this type of cable is what we call a straight through cable, where identical pins are directly connected to the similar pin on one end and the same pin to the other end. So this kind of cable is called a straight through cable, where each pin connects directly to an identical pin on the other end of the cable. Okay, let us try to discuss another scenario when we replace the switch, the switch to the right with another router, and we still use a straight through cable. I'm sure by virtue of the rules of communication, we don't see any communication taking place, because we know that a device cannot receive from the same pins it uses to transmit, because this one will cause collision and data loss. So they have to use separate pins. So a straight through connecting two routers will not work, because routers transmit on pin 1 and 2 and cannot also receive on the same pins. So it means that in this case, if we again interchange and use switches, switches transmit on pin 3 and 6, so they cannot still receive on pin 3 and 6. So even here, transmission will not be possible. So what is the solution here? We are actually using a wrong cable. the solution is a different cable, which is a crossover cable. So how does a crossover look? Instead of pins connecting directly to the identical pins on the other end, the pins or the wires are crossed just like that. So pin 1 will connect to pin 3 and pin 2 will connect to pin 6 and the same on the other side. So this also allows full duplex transmission without any issue. Then also the same thing, a PC and the router. So sometimes someone will say router and PCs are different, and we know that straight through cables are used to interconnect different devices. Okay, true, a router is different from the PC physically, but logically and the pins they use to transmit and receive, they are actually the same. So that doesn't make them different. They are actually the same in their logical setup. So we cannot use a straight through. We must use a crossover cable to allow them to be able to communicate in full duplex mode. So that is actually how transmission will take place. Then let us actually summarize the different interfaces or the different pins that are used by different network devices. The common ones, we have routers, we have firewalls, we have PC, and then we have switch. So we look at the transmission pin for the router. So they transmit on 1 and 2 and receive on 3 and 6. Then also firewalls transmit on 1 and 2 and receive on 3 and 6. PCs also, like the ones before, transmit on 1 and 2 and then receive on 3 and 6. So it is the switch that is different from the rest. For it transmits on 3 and 6 and receives on 1 and 2. So you need to be familiar with this. This one will give you a clear understanding, especially when it comes to preparing these cables and doing the right termination for every cable that you may need to use. Okay, so let's also discuss something. Communication using a straight through while connecting similar devices does not work logically. So the solution is auto mdi-x. If you want to use a straight through cable to connect similar devices. So how is that possible? Auto mdi-x is actually a feature that allows a device to sense which interfaces are used to receive and which interfaces are used to transmit. So they automatically adjust and data will be transmitted without any fail. So you don't have to worry about which cable to use. If the device is auto MDI enabled, there is no need to worry about which cable to use. Whether it is a straight through or a crossover, the cable will work without any problem as long as the device is auto MDI enabled. So it allows the device to automatically switch which interface it uses to receive, and then it will be able to receive without any problem. So this is done logically. So it is internal. It is not something that is controlled externally. So it is just a programmable concept which is within the device. Okay, now when it comes to 1000 and then 10G, that is 1000 megabits, which is gigabit Ethernet, and 10 gigabit Ethernet. We said all the 4 pairs are used. So we have seen so far the first 2 pairs, that is 1 and 2, and then 3 and 6. So the next pair is pin 4 and 5, and then the last one is 7 and 8. So each pair is bi-directional. So transmission is actually bi-directional. So another type of cable besides UTP is the optic fiber or the fiber optic connection. So when you look at this switch, it has RJ45 interfaces, and also it has 4 fiber optic cables, the same to this router, which has more optic fiber interfaces and only 4 RJ45 connectors. Then these are actually called small form factor pluggable. So those are actually SAP transceivers which are actually plugged in where the fiber cables are connected. So this is actually how a fiber cable looks. Now transmission takes place in this manner. One end is used to receive and the other end is used to transmit, just like that. So transmission also still take place without any collision. So it supports full duplex as well. So this is actually layout of optic fiber, or the fiber optic connection, where we have the fiberglass which transmits the data, and then we have the cladding which actually reflects the light, and then we have the protective buffer which protects the fiberglass from breaking, and then we have the outer jacket of the cable. So we have two types of fiber cables. We have the single mode and then the multi-mode fiber. Let us look at them one by one. So multi-mode has a wider diameter than the single mode fiber. So it means it can allow multiple angles or multiple modes of light or of light waves to enter the fiberglass. Then also it allows larger cables than UTP, but shorter than single mode fiber. Then they are cheaper than single mode fiber because they use cheaper LED based SFP. Then for single mode, the diameter is narrower than the multi-mode fiber, and then light enters at a single angle from a laser-based transmitter, and then it allows longer cables than both UTP and multi-mode, and then they are more expensive because they use laser-based SFP. Then this is actually how they are standardized under the IEEE by following their various speeds, that is from 1000 and then 10G and then still 10G and 1000, where we have multi-mode fiber and single mode fiber at gigabit Ethernet standardized under 802.3Z, and that is 1000 base LX. Now for multi-mode, it can span maximum of 550 meters, and for single mode it can go up to 5 kilometers. Then at 10G, multimode is standardized at 802.3 AE, which is informally known as 10G base SR, but covering a maximum of 400 meters. Then the same 10G at single mode, standardized under the same, which is 802.3 AE, as 10 base LR, but it can go as long as 10 kilometers. Then lastly, 10G still at single mode fiber under 802.3 AE, informally known as 10G base ER, which can go up to 30 kilometers. So single mode can really span very, very long distances. So you can connect different different towns or different metropolitan areas. Okay, let us just look at some of the comparison between UTP and fiber optic cabling. So when you look at UTP, when it comes to cost, they are of lower cost than fiber, and then they cover shorter maximum distances than fiber, which is usually approximately 100 meters, and then they can be vulnerable to electromagnetic interference. Then RJ45 ports used with UTP are always cheaper than SFP ports, and then they emit a faint signal outside of the cable, which can actually act as a security risk. Then for the other fiber optic, they are of higher cost. They cover longer distances, and also they are not vulnerable to EMI, so they are heavily protected. Then SLP ports are more expensive than RJ45. Then also they don't emit any signal outside of the cable, so there are no security risks when it comes to fiber cabling. Okay, so that marks the end of our episode 2, which is cables and interfaces, and basically we have discussed some concepts, but other concepts, because we don't want the video to be really so long, we are going to stop at that point. The rest of the concepts will be covered in part 2 and part 3 respectively under steel cables and interfaces. So I have some review questions which you can actually try to judge yourself, try them out, and then always get going. Okay, let us look at question 1, which says you connect two old routers together with a UTP cable. However, data is not successfully sent and received between them. What would be the problem? So part A, they are connected with a straight through cable. Part B, they are connected with a crossover. And part 3, they are operating in auto mdi-x. So you can try to solve these problems and see whether you get the correct answers. If you can, please answer them and share your solutions in the comment section. We shall actually try to interact through the comment section as much as we can. Then question 2 is saying your company wants to connect switches in 2 separate buildings that are about 150 meters apart. They want to keep costs down if possible. What kind of cable they use? So you have a list of those. Pick the most appropriate one. Then we have question 3. Your company wants to connect 2 offices that are about 3 kilometers apart. They want to keep costs down possible. Which kind of cable should they use? Also have option there. Choose the most appropriate one. Just try to review in case you didn't get things clearly. You can rewatch the video to get the concept. Then question 4, we bring that image there. The switch has the following indication over its network interfaces. So what would happen if you connect it to an identical switch with a straight through cable? So you have options there. Then finally, your company needs to connect many end hosts on a switch which is in a wiring cabinet on the same office floor as the hosts. What kind of cable should they use? Still, you have options there. Okay, so feel free to answer them. If you don't understand concept, feel free to rewatch the video. And then also my request is please subscribe to the channel and always drop your comments in case of anything that you would like to be rectified, anything that you would like to be clarified, and share the videos with your colleagues, and also invite your colleagues to like the channel. Channel name is Emerson254. Please make sure you support the channel. Let us grow the channel together as we learn together. See you in episode 2, part 2, which will come next as a continuation of this episode. Thank you for watching and have a good time.